Hello and welcome into this week's edition of Freightonomics. We will have Dr. Zach Rogers coming on the show here in a bit to talk about the latest LMI. And of course, I will be asking him if there's any semblance of an impact that we're seeing from government activity, such as the shutdown and or the tariffs, the tariff ruling that is currently looming about the legality of the Trump tariffs. Now, we're in November now. It should be getting close to peak season activity from the retailers. The LMI had some interesting points around the retail sector specifically that we're going to talk about. But before we get into any of that, I think we need to set the table with just a quick read on the market itself using some of that sonar data that we like to use to read the market. So as soon as that's ready, we can just set the table and run it. 3, 2, 1. All right, looking here first, NTI versus OTRI. This is the spot rate versus the tender rejection rate. These are going to be measures of capacity. So the higher these numbers go, the tighter the market is. Tender rejections biased towards that larger contracted freight, and they are up, they're elevated, but they're not spiking on the same level as the NTI or the spot market is. The spot market, of course, seeing some decent little devil's towers there where we've had this undulation. Specifically, it seems related to increased raids or regulatory behavior targeting the segment of small carriers and operators out there. Spot rates have been very volatile. I've talked to several brokerages here in the last month or so that say that this market is becoming increasingly touchy in terms of whether or not you can secure capacity, especially on the spot market level. The contract market, a little bit more stable with tender rejection rates, still 6%. That's still a fairly high figure considering where we've been over the last couple of years. Now, what makes tender rejection rates elevation increasingly interesting is the next chart here, the OTVI. Tender volumes are 17% down year over year, and they don't look like they're really trying to get any better anytime soon. Tender volumes on the floor, and of course, a large chunk of this is due to modal conversion. Intermodal has really taken a lot of share from the truckload market this year because of the increased amount of time that a lot of shippers have brought these goods into the country. And of course, it gives them a little bit more time to have some rolling on rail cars and gets into a warehouse for a little bit longer stretch of time. Sense of urgency, though, does increase around the holidays, so we might see a little bit of an uptick here in demand. Let's go to the next chart and look at tender rejection rates compared with demand. Now, this may be the single most important chart for those of you that don't understand that demand and supply don't always move in the same way. Tender rejection rates going up in white, tender volumes coming down in yellow. A very strange mechanism as demand appears to be falling and capacity is tightening. That is not the traditional way that we think about supply and demand dynamics, especially in the truckload market. So that being said, there's a few stories, and again, I'm running solo today because my compadres are ill, but there's a few stories that I think we should at least mention before I go ahead and bring on Dr. Rogers. But one of the ones is going to be the U.S. freight market reverses gains in third quarter as volumes fall. I think this is a pretty, this just iterates on what I was just talking about. Volumes fell. This is U.S. Bank Freight Payment Index. Shipper spending increased 2%. Freight shipments fell 2.9%, according to this index. The reason I bring this up is so you know that this is just not me espousing, the sonar data. This is another completely separate index, completely separate data set that says the exact same thing. Now, not on the same scale that I just mentioned it, but it's telling the same story that rates have gone up, spend has gone up, volumes have come down. So that is a weird mechanism that we normally don't talk about in the same sentence. Shipments are down 10.7% compared to last year, while freight spend is down 1.7% in total. So the invoice payment rate itself is higher, but the total spend is lower because they're not shipping as much stuff. So this is not going to really mess with a lot of these shipper budgets as much as it would traditionally because they're also not shipping as much stuff. So the volume is down, therefore their budgets are also going to be a little bit safer. Manufacturing appears to be negatively impacted by tariffs. This is not a secret at this point. Dr. Rogers has mentioned this himself a few times that a lot of the manufacturing processes going on in the United States are of that final finished good process where it's a much more complicated type assembly process, whereas in China you have kind of the basic manufacturing processes being taken care of over there. So more inputs being shipped out from China. We take in a lot of those inputs to finish our stuff and our products. And that's a problem when you're talking about trying to navigate tariffs. That means we can't finish a bunch of stuff as people are trying to figure out different procurement strategies and find some of these raw inputs. Now, the next storyline here, of course, just an iteration. We have seen this. This is going to be something to watch moving forward. More than 7,000 truckers reportedly sidelined for English proficiency violations. I get asked this question constantly around all this. Of course, it's been politicized heavily, but at the same time, there's some validity here that we've probably gotten a little loose as a industry around the enforcement of safety, some of the things that kind of lead into safer practices in the space. And of course, a little bit more regulation and vetting on some of these driver populations. Reading and understanding English, of course, does naturally make things a little bit safer. But that's neither here nor there for this discussion specifically, as it means in the context of this story that it's about capacity leaving the market. The market has been really challenging over the last couple of years. This regulatory behavior, the increasing regulatory behavior, is only going to exacerbate the exodus of capacity, which was already starting to escalate. Now, specifically, Texas and Arizona have reported some of the highest out-of-service counts under the revived rule that went into place in July this year. So definitely those markets, ones to watch, especially since it's right down there on the border. And then the last thing that I want to talk about here, and it's really just an introduction to bringing on the man, Dr. Zach Rogers here. LMI read, October LMI shows price increases outpace capacity growth. I mean, lots of stuff to break apart here, but I think it's interesting, and I'm sure Dr. Z wants to jump in on this, is we had a reversal of course in the transportation indices this month that we're talking about the market kind of softening, prices going down, capacity coming up. That's no longer apparently true. So the forward outlooks too look very similar, reminiscent to this point last year, where a lot of the shipping community appears to be expecting prices to continue to increase at a pretty rapid pace. And that's fascinating to me because they have not felt it significantly yet. So that's more of a, we just expect things to change. So with that being said, let's bring on Dr. Z here and really break it down in detail. Dr. Z, thank you for joining the Zach Show today, as it's just me, my buddy Thomas.
You hired another co-host. You're like Liza Minnelli, just running through husbands. There's new ones every time.
Well, Thomas is sick. He's been on the road a bunch lately. So you catch a bunch of stuff when you're out there doing your road show. So, I was like, you know what? I got the man this week. I think we can handle it just fine. So I let him rest it out.
I think we'll have plenty to talk about. Yeah. I do. Well, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with transportation flipping back? That seems like what we were just.
Let's
all
do
right.
it.
So
this is
a big
fascinating reversal.
Yes, absolutely. So we had a big movement this month where, one of the things we always look at with our index is whether capacity for transportation is growing faster or slower than transportation prices. You can almost think of, capacity as supply and price as demand. And so you want supply and demand to sort of be in equilibrium. And if you're a carrier, it's nice when demand's a little higher than supply. Well, that had not been the case through really August and September. We saw capacity growing faster both months. Now, last month it was, and I said this when I was here last month, it was by like a point. I mean, it was not a huge inversion, but it was an inversion, and it was something to keep our eye on. It's funny because that inversion really carried through the first half of October as well. In October, the first, we kind of broke it, first 2.5 weeks of October, capacity was all the way up at 61, which is the highest reading we've had for that in, years. And price was at 52. And then something happened right around like October 17, 18, right in there, totally flips. And price goes up to a 65, capacity goes down to a 51, which means like we barely have excess capacity. And those two together brought us to the overall numbers that we reported this month, which was a 61.7 for transportation price, which is the highest we've had in quite a few months, and transportation capacity at 54.5. So essentially what that means is we went from, you know, supply being higher than demand for 2 months to now it flips back and demand is higher than supply. And that was really driven not only by movements in the second half of the month, but by movements downstream at the retail level. You know, if you look at our retail respondents, their transportation capacity was at 56, their transportation price is at 70. And so that's really robust levels of growth by the retailers. Upstream, this are manufacturers, wholesalers. Their growth for price is 56, much more moderate. And really, what it shows is we're finally having. You know, we've been talking all year about all of this sort of potential energy in the supply chain. We have all this inventory that's just been stuck up here waiting for Christmas. And now finally we're converting that into kinetic energy, and we're seeing it really start to move down supply chains towards retailers, towards consumers. You know, generally we would see retail inventories, and this is really something that's changed since COVID. You know, pre-COVID, retailers always wanted inventories to peak like right around Thanksgiving, you know, right ahead of Black Friday, Cyber Monday, all that. When COVID happened, it showed the limits of trying to do everything in 5 weeks. And so since then, we've really had retail inventories now peak in like mid-October. Okay, so like 5 weeks really before they used to. And that is what we saw this year. Now, what we really saw, I guess, is retail inventory started to come down. And, you know, so we hit that peak in mid-October, but instead of, you know, as we would normally see, all the inventory rushes in right before we need it and then rushes out, we saw all that inventory get here like 6 months ago. And some of it 3 months ago. You know, July was the biggest month ever at the Port of LA. And so we had all this inventory just sitting in supply chains, a lot of it at the wholesale level, just waiting around for you know, the second Amazon Prime Day to show up. Which, by the way, second Amazon Prime Day, $9.1 billion moved. That's a pretty big bump from last year. And now finally it's here, and we can see this inventory start to move through the system. You know, it's funny because the overall index this month was 57.4, which is exactly the same as it was in September. And so you think, oh, okay, not much movement. But actually what we saw was a huge increase in all our transportation metrics and a decrease in our warehousing and inventory metrics, because now all that inventory that had been sitting static, filling up warehouses, is starting to move. And that movement means, once again, we're engaging transportation, especially downstream. Not so this isn't every lane, but especially downstream going into major metros and stuff, we are seeing an engagement in transportation finally, after what seems like forever of just sitting on all this inventory.
You know, you make a fantastic point. I wish I had broken down the OTVI into long and short haul volumes, because the shorter haul stuff is exactly what you're talking about with retailers. It's that downstream stuff that, you know, that DC to storefront or fulfillment center type movement that's really held up and has actually started growing here in the last couple of weeks. It's been pretty robust. The long haul volume is completely desolate. It's hard to it's really hard to separate what's been a modal conversion, but it looks like kind of what you're alluding to is the fact that they had this stuff sitting there already, just ready to go, and they really don't need to move anything else because it's been there for so long, kind of stagnant and waiting. And I'm glad you talked about the inventory levels, because that's the exact next chart that I want to bring up. The LMI inventory levels have been in this middling area, kind of in the low to mid 50s for a while, and the huge drop from inventory. Is this inventories? Yeah, this is inventories. So the white line there dropping down below 50. Is that right? I mean, that looks like a pretty sharp decline. Is that the retailers just bleeding
Yes,
their?
that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, we dropped down below 50, like you said, for inventories in October. It's the first time we've had contraction in inventories since like last summer.
Right.
So it's May, June, and July last year we had contraction as well, and that was really like a JIT thing that was going on.
Right.
But yeah, inventories started to finally contract, which again, like we said earlier, inventory should be building
Right.
in October. But what this is indicative of is that inventories were so built up earlier in the year. I remember maybe I think I came on in June or July,
Mm-hmm.
and Thomas back when he was healthy had said something about like, oh, it's Twin Peaks this year.
Right.
We have
Right.
sort of peak season upstream, peak season downstream. And so that peak season upstream now, what that's led to is finally things are starting to come down. What's interesting is those declines are really led at the retail level. And again, I think it shows that we are finally starting to move inventory through sales to consumers. So retail inventories are 47.6 this month, which means we're starting to sell stuff. Upstream is at 50.8, which means basically baseline replenishment. I mean, we did see increased port activity in October, especially the second half of October relative to like the second half of November, which was dead at the
Oh,
ports.
right. Right.
We saw some increased activity. So we are getting replenishment.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think was really fascinating this month is that the smaller firms got into the act. One of the stories of the last 6 months is that little firms, and the way we break it down is all of our respondents with less than 1,000 employees, we put them in the little category, and they had been carrying huge inventory loads all summer. Last month in the September report, they were at 61.7. In October, they're at 49. Which is exactly the same as what the large firms were, also at 49. And so it shows that, there's two pieces of this, right? So it was retailers telling their wholesalers, hold on to everything. It was also large firms, which aren't always retailers, but many times are, telling their smaller partners, hold on to it. Tell you what, why don't you keep it in your storage unit, and I'll tell you when I'm ready for it. And so we finally saw the smaller firms in our response base start to unload all this stuff. Now, what's interesting about us unloading is this does not mean that inventories are low. That chart you showed, that white line was inventory levels. The pink line, or purple line, sorry, is inventory cost. Look how far apart those two are. We're 24 points apart between our inventory levels and inventory cost. That's not totally normal. If you look back in 22 to 23, you can kind of see how those move together. Like when inventory levels go up, costs go up. When inventory levels go down, costs go down. Right now, they're just sort of widening out. And so that delta is really high. And the reason it's high is because, yes, we have less inventory than last month. But last month, we had a whole bunch of inventory. And so costs are still high. The other piece of that is a lot of these costs that are flowing through the supply chain have tariffs associated with them. I grabbed all of the sort of treasury data looking at duties collected from imports. And over the last 3 months, we've collected $86 billion in import taxes. Okay. In a normal 3-month period, that should be 21 billion. Okay. Wow. So there's an extra $65 billion of costs incurred as stuff is coming in. Okay. Right. And so that $65 billion has to go somewhere. It's not all going to consumers, but it is one of the reasons why we see that delta where we have inventory contracting at 49 and costs growing at 73, which is super robust, because partly, and when we get to future predictions, I really want to talk about this split too, we have huge costs coming in from the tariffs. And so it's really driving a weird spread right now between overall inventory levels and how much we're paying for it. It's not dissimilar, honestly, Zach, from what you were talking about earlier with transportation, where volume is lower, but prices are up.
Increasing. It's just costing more.
Thing we're seeing, and I have to imagine there's some link there.
Yeah, it's just costing more to do the same thing. And some of that's tariff related, and some of it's probably just operational inefficiency with all the uncertainty and cloudiness. Now, something that might create a little bit of certainty, and I want to get your quick thoughts on this, is that, you talked about the tariffs. We've got the Supreme Court seems pretty cynical about the leveraging of power and the executive branch on these tariffs. Have you heard anything, or are there any thoughts here around whether or not how this is going to play out?
Well, I was following Polymarket yesterday. I saw it's down to like a 20% chance that they're going to pass. I do love that we live in a time where we can bet on Supreme
Bet on
Court
it.
rulings. I always wonder if there's, like when I was watching yesterday, I was like, hopefully there's not a Chauncey Billups type
Oh
law
no.
clerk in there passing information on. Big shot Chauncey. Anyway, to me, what it seems like this will be is like a bump in the road in some ways.
Okay.
This does not mean that tariffs are going away. Like, just to be clear, the tariffs that are on trial are the blanket tariffs on countries. So saying like, oh, we have to have this tariff on Canada because it's a security risk. That is legally tenuous. What is not tenuous is, well, we can have a tariff on soft wood that mainly comes from Canada, because we want to protect the soft wood industry. That is the part that's not on trial. And so what I think we're going to probably see, and this is based on talking to a couple people, and I just did a panel with some economists back at the university last week, and one of the things that came up was the targeted tariffs probably are still within the purview of the president, because you can make the case that is a security issue. Blanket tariffs are more like a tax, which is probably
Right.
something that has to come from Congress if they ever go back to work. And so what my guess is, especially based on reading everything about the arguments yesterday, it seems like the blanket tariffs are going to go away, and probably they'll be replaced by some targeted tariffs. And my hope with that is that we actually will then start targeting the tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can make a case for steel and aluminum tariffs if you really want to protect steel and aluminum. Now, yes, there's more producers that use steel and aluminum in the US than steel and aluminum factory workers, but let's leave that aside. Let's just say you want to protect that. Then you can start to use tariffs like a scalpel. Tariffs are much more effective as a scalpel than they are as a sledgehammer. And that's kind of what we've been doing. I mean, when you just say tariff everything, I think we've really run into the law of unintended consequences this year,
For sure.
where you don't realize all of the things that are tariffs. So to me, my guess is what we'll see is the country level tariffs will go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't then be surprised to see maybe an uptick, and you've already seen this a little bit already, an uptick in individual tariffs on specific industries, to try to protect certain things. But you also have to keep in mind the affordability piece and what's going on with jobs. We lost 153,000 positions, or there was 153,000 layoffs last year, is what I read this morning. And inflation is still right around 3%. So at some point, you are playing with fire a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe the Supreme Court ruling will lead to us being a little more careful about where we're throwing matches.
Yeah, we got a couple of minutes left here, but I want to make sure I want to hear your take on government shutdown. Did your respondents talk about it at all, or to cite it as an issue moving forward? Because it is one of the longer ones we've ever had. And then also the forward look here, like as we get out of this year, and I'm sure the government will eventually go back to work at some point in time, hopefully before Thanksgiving, so that the airports can run again. But I'd like to get that one, and then of course the forward look here in the last 2.5 minutes.
The main thing that we saw was people worried that consumer spending might not be as robust
Mm-hmm.
as we had thought it was. It's funny because basically with the ways inventory has been moving, our respondents have been betting that Americans with credit cards will still show up for the holiday season, and because generally that's like the greatest bet you can make. I mean, it's like betting on Tiger Woods in 2001. I mean, it's just lock solid. The problem is with the shutdown. We already saw last week reefer loads down 15% because there's less groceries being shipped, because there's 40 million people relying on the SNAP benefits. I mean, that to me is a pretty big deal, right? And last time we saw the cost of food go way up was when Russia invaded Ukraine in March of 2022. And you remember suddenly the cost of fertilizer and wheat was way up. Gas went up too, which that won't happen this time. But wheat and stuff's way up. And so when groceries go up, what happens? People spend money on food and less money on, retail products. Okay. And so if that happens, it could really put a dent in consumer spending, and this sort of little burst of energy we've seen out of the transportation market could really slow down if people have to spend more money on food and not have money left for Christmas presents and stuff like that. So that, to me, in talking to our respondents, that's sort of the biggest worry right now, is that if you're on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you got to buy bread before you buy shoes or an Xbox or something like that. Looking forward at our future predictions, we saw something really interesting this month, which is our respondents think that inventories will be leaner next year. So the overall number they returned for inventory levels was 47.5, meaning that inventories will be lower over the next year than they were this year. And that's really aggravated for downstream. Our retailers are saying inventory is going to be 40.2. Okay, that is a significant decline from the amount of inventories we've seen this year. At the same time, we're predicting overall inventory costs of 72.5. So again, we're getting into this thing where inventories are going to come down, but costs are going to be up, probably because of tariffs. Now I do think that our respondents are thinking tariffs will be sort of at least settled at wherever they're going to be. And I mean, a year from now will be a month before midterm elections. So you would imagine they would have to be settled by then, because warehousing capacity is at 51, transportation capacity at 41, meaning, and then prices at 72.4 and 79.7, meaning that basically we'll go to sort of a just in time, turn this over as fast as we can. This year, the strategy we used with tariffs was build up inventories as much as possible to avoid the costs that are coming later. Well, next year, if the costs are already there at the beginning, then what you'll do instead is run incredibly lean. So as lean as we possibly can to try to mitigate the cost so that we're turning over fast, which will improve cash flow. On the carrier side, that would actually not be a bad thing because it says we're going to be making a lot of trips. Our transportation price metric for the future prediction, 79.7, which is really, really high, and shows that we'll be having a lot of utilization. Now, the one thing that makes me nervous about this is that when you add our three cost metrics together for the predictions for next year, it comes in at 224.6, which is mildly inflationary on the supply side. And so essentially, if I was to boil it all down, inventories will be lower, but they'll be turning over faster. And because they're turning over faster, we could see some pretty notable price growth throughout the logistics industry in 2026.
Oh, so basically, and I had him at a few minutes because I definitely wanted to hear the outlook completely. That's a fascinating outlook. So, effectively, there's not really a sign that we're going to see a significant slowdown purely over time. It's just things are going to cost a little bit more, and we're going to manage things a little bit more fluidly. Am I reading that right?
I think so, because instead of the start, stop, we're just going to do a bunch of movement. And, we might be more LTL, for instance.
Yeah.
Maybe less intermodal. I think we'll keep things as lean as possible because turning it over is the best sort of preventative tactic you can take against costs being baked in from the very, very beginning. Instead of taking one big Costco trip every Saturday, we're just going to the grocery store every night to buy dinner because we don't want to have more than that in the refrigerator because it's expensive.
Is that not just inefficiency though? Like, doesn't that actually reduce productivity, or am I missing something economically there?
I think it's, this 2025 was, we erred on the side of being way too heavy.
Right.
These numbers look like we're erring on the side of being a little light.
Okay.
To me in 2026.
And that actually could,
because of the big cost.
Yeah, and that could lead to more like last minute shipping, which of course, you got expedited. I remember back in the day, I was running expedited freight for a minute, and if you run real lean, that last minute, because missing on revenue is way more expensive than missing your transportation service situation. So yeah, that's interesting. So we'll see how it plays out.
If this holds, there's going to be a lot of last minute rushes next year.
Man, all right. Well, we'll see where things are here in December, because we'll at least have the front edge of the holiday shipping season under our belts the next time we talk. Unless you're going on, one of your 3-month vacations in school, or what do they do now? They still have the Christmas vacation didn't extend into the entire month of December this year, did it?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I got to teach till December 20th, man.
Man.
Actually, Look, I have 6 months where I don't do anything, and then I have somewhere I work really hard.
Oh, man. Slave driving. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.